Abstractionism by Shah, Maddie Fairchild, and Kylie Knight. There have been many art movements throughout history. Each one has contributed in the evolution of what we consider abstractionism. In order to fully understand how abstractionism came to be, we need to do a recap of all of the art movements that came before abstractionism, starting with neoclassicism. This art movement was brought about by the Enlightenment and the changing ideals. The Age of Enlightenment was a movement beginning in the late 17th century that encouraged people to abandon tradition and emphasize reason and individualism instead. The subject matter of neoclassicist paintings is mostly heroic, historic, and symbolic. The style of neoclassicism is characterized by symmetry, simplicity, clean lines, and balance. As you can see, in this painting there is a very obvious focal point, and there are direct lines running from all of the citizens to Homer's head. The lines are very distinct, and the painting depicts a historical scene of great significance. This painting was called The Apotheosis of Homer and was painted by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres in 1827. The next art movement, Romanticism, was a rebellion against the Age of Enlightenment. It called for emphasis on emotion, passion, and direct contact with experience as a source of truth and happiness. Romanticism also highlights the wild, ever-changing nature around us and the need for personal inspiration in humans outside of the corrupting influence of society. The style of Romanticism consists of rough and unfinished lines, wild and chaotic brushstrokes, and vivid colors. The subject matter is usually the individual or nature, and consists of an exotic and passionate component. In Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, by Caspar David Friedrich, painted in 1818, the man is staring out into an abyss. This implies his personal inspiration from the vastness of the nature around him. The lines are not as rough as in other typical romantic paintings, but this painting displays the individual and nature splendidly. The third art movement is realism. This art movement is different from the last two because it does not try to glorify everyday life. The scenes are normally of the ordinary, observable world and emphasize social and physical realities. The style of these paintings consists of smooth brushwork, large canvases, and a snapshot moment in real life. In 1857, Jean-François Millet painted The Gleaners, which depicts two men working. The painting does not glorify the job of these two men. Rather, it highlights its ordinariness. It is a fairly objective painting that shows the snapshot moment style of realist paintings. Impressionism, the next movement, began as a result of the invention of the camera. It shows scenes from everyday life just like realism. The subjects are ordinary scenes from everyday life, and it often invites audience participation. The style of painting consists of light, vibrant colors, quick, big brushstrokes, and unusual angles. In Ballet Rehearsal on Stage by Edgar Degas in 1874, the subject matter is the young ballet dancer on side stage. She does not look like a perfect little girl. She is scratching her back. This painting implies that these lower-class ballerinas are involved in prostitution, which was an everyday thing back then. This last art movement is called Expressionism, where the artist chooses to depict subject emotions and responses to the world rather than the objective scene they see. The painting shown here is The Scream by Edvard Munch, painted in 1895. The Scream is the popular name given to each of 4 versions of a composition created as both paintings and pastels. Expressionist artists accomplish their goals through distortion, exaggeration, primitivism, fantasy, and through the vivid, jarring, violent, or dynamic application of formal elements. This art movement was meant to impose the artist's own representation of the world. Now, our art movement, Abstractionism. Abstractionism is defined as the visual language of shapes, forms, lines, and colors to interpret a subject matter. It's different from traditional forms of art because other forms have literal representations, while abstractionism is open for interpretation. There can be 3 strands of abstractionism. Number 1, reduction of natural appearances to radically simplified forms. Number 2, art that's non-representational and basic geometric shapes. Number 3, spontaneous free expression. There can also be two forms of abstractionism. The first form is intellectual, structural, geometric, rectangular, and logical, where the second is emotional and intuitional. Abstractionism artists in general have always tried to find new ways to react to the changing world around them. Before abstract art, it was widely believed that the value of the picture was a matter of color and shapes alone. Abstract subject matter dates back to Plato in 350 BC, who experimented with shapes. But the 20th century brought new advancements in technology that demanded an even bigger response than artists in the past. Abstract art was born in the decade 1910 to 1920 and is now regarded as the most characteristic form of 20th century art. Abstractionism as a term refers to the modern paintings and sculptures that abandon the traditional European concept of art. It was thought of as an embodiment of Western freedom of thought. It engages the intellect but also emotions, and the most important part of abstractionist art is the feeling response to the piece, not the art itself. Abstractionist art doesn't depict recognizable scenes or objects. It is made of forms and colors that are there for their own expressive sake. Abstractionism came about because painters sought freedom outside of nature and society. They were willing to experiment with all aspects of life. All subject matter lends itself to interpretation through this form of art. Abstractionism communicates with us in a way that lets everyone find their own interpretation. There is no right answer. Sometimes even questioning what is abstractionism can get in the way of enjoying the art. Personality, feeling, and formal sensibility are all highlighted in abstract art. And many artists saw abstractionism as a challenge and a way to express their most deeply felt ideas. Abstractionist painters have been indifferent to common motifs, but have found their own unique style. There are many criticisms, however, of abstractionist art. Some people say abstract painters distort natural shapes and make a judgment of the external world.
Wassily Kandinsky was born on December 16th in 1866 in Moscow, Russia, into a well-off business-owning family. He learned to play the piano and cello and began drawing lessons. From a young age, Wassily was artistically inclined. I remember that drawing and a little bit later painting lifted me out of reality, he later wrote in a book about his childhood. Even in his childhood works, you may notice specific color combinations, which he explained by the fact that each color lives by its own mysterious life. Wassily's parents decided to make him a lawyer. He graduated with honors and 6 years later married his cousin, Anna Chimyakina. He became a law professor at age 30. Wassily was appointed as the professor of the Department of Law at Delft University, but rejected this career to dedicate his time to painting. Wassily recalled two events that influenced his decision: his visitation of an exhibit full of French Impressionists at 1895, and the emotional shock he experienced from Claude Monet's Haystacks and Richard Wagner's Lohengrin. Afterward, Wassily participated and was active during the Blue Rider period in Germany in 1911 through 1914. Kandinsky's paintings of color and writing in the Blue Rider Almanac and his book The Treatise on the Spiritual in Art defended and promoted abstract art. Wassily's ideas and expressionistic views of art were ultimately rejected by, at the time, radical members of the Institute and were deemed too individualistic to understand. The Blue Rider period began because of Kandinsky's creative nature and attraction to anything intellectual and restless. He started a group he called Phalanx, and later, in 1911, Kandinsky, together with his friend Franz Marc, established the Blue Rider group. They described their art as accenting made on revealing associative properties of color, line, composition, and they used various sources such as Goethe and Philipp Rung's romantic color schemes. During the Bauhaus movement in Switzerland during 1922 through 1933, Kandinsky painted and taught at the Bauhaus, and his teachings took on geometric elements and used a lot of circles, half circles, angles, straight lines, and curves. The impact of an angle of a triangle on a circle produces an effect no less powerful than God's finger touching Adam in a Michelangelo, he described. There was no other time when Kandinsky's painting developed as promptly as during the Munich years, wrote M.K. Lacoste. At times, it is hard to understand why at the beginning the founder of abstract painting selected the plots typical for Biedermeier style, fans, crinolines, and riders. The style of his work of the early period can be called neither conditional nor pretentious, but in them nothing portended a radical renovation of painting. However, only few artists are known to have the luck to show simultaneously originality in form and content. At first, it was important for Kandinsky to try out his own opportunities of expression. Though no one can deny that Kandinsky's Evening had its own originality, however, it is difficult to imagine that it was created by the very first artist who, in 5 to 6 years, would bring the first abstract work in 1910 to the history of the art world. What a great creative force should operate in Kandinsky. What prompt evolution from 1908 to 1914, from his landscapes, though bold already in color and form, but still true to nature, like houses in Murnau and Obermarkt, that differ from a chaotic sketch called Gorge, drawn in 1914. Those differ from restless compositions in a series of pictures called Seasons in Guggenheim's museum. It would be difficult to guess that it was the hand of the same artist in the rather objective Crusaders, painted in 1903, and in such abstract work as Composition 7 in 1913. Despite their common dynamics, here is a constrained impulse and there is a liberated movement. At the same time, Kandinsky contributed to literary activity. In 1912, Concerning the Spiritual in Art was published, turning upside down the established idea about art in general. This book became the first theoretical foundation of abstractionism. Having come to an idea that the purpose and therefore means of nature and art are essentially, organically, and according to the laws of the universe, are various and equally great and equally strong. The artist proclaimed the self-creative process of self-expression and self-development of spirit. Kandinsky also wrote memoirs looking back in 1913 and the collection of verses Sounds in 1913 with 55 black and white color lithographs. When the World War began, Kandinsky was compelled to leave Germany. On August 3, 1914, he moved to Switzerland where Kandinsky started to work on a book about point and line. During these crisis years of revolution, Kandinsky also began alternating between half-abstract idiom, impressionist landscapes, and romantic fantasies. In his abstract pictures, geometrization of separate elements became stronger, and for that reason, its first proper process of simplification, and secondly, the avant-garde artistic atmosphere of Moscow at that time. In Russia, Kandinsky was the center of the post-revolutionary cultural and political development. From 1918 till 1921, he cooperated with the People's Committee of Education in the field of art training and museum reform. 1919 and 1921, he published 6 big articles. As chairman of the State Purchasing Commission at the Museum Bureau of the ISO Department of Narkompros, he participated in founding 22 museums. But Kandinsky renders the biggest influence as a teacher of the Moscow Free Workshops. Being its professor since October 1918, he designed a special curriculum based on the analysis of color and form, developing the ideas stated on the spiritual in art. Then, participating in the foundation and management of the Moscow Institute of Artistic Culture, he designed a curriculum for it based on his theory. However, his opinion differed from the opinion of the board of the institute. Kandinsky's opponents, Rodchenko, Stepnova, and Popova, are in favor of the exact analysis of materials for their constructive arrangement and setting. Any display of irrationality in creative process was emphatically denied. Kandinsky, in his turn, vigorously opposed the constructive opponents. He stated, "Just because an artist uses abstract methods, it does not mean that he is an abstract artist. It doesn't even mean that he is an artist. Just that there are enough dead triangles, be that they white or green, that there are just as many dead roosters, dead horses, or dead guitars. One can just as easily be a realist academic as an abstract academic. A form without content is not a hand, just an empty glove full of air." The unceasing attacks on his colleagues, artists considering his works as mutilated spiritualism, were a deciding factor for Kandinsky to leave Moscow in December of 1921. The pressure of socialist ideology upon art, which led to eventually the appearance of social realism, began in 1922. Kandinsky's pictures for many years are put away from the Soviet museums. After returning to Germany, Kandinsky accepts the invitation of Walter Gropius, the founder of a well-known Bauhaus school. He again taught and developed the ideas. They dealt with, first of all, the deep analytical studying of separate elements in a picture, which resulted in point and line to plane in 1926. Kandinsky also worked much and experimented with color, applying his analytical foundation and the conclusions in his teaching. Kandinsky's works again underwent changes. The individual geometrical elements increasingly entered the foreground. His palette was sated with cold color harmonies, which at times are perceived as a dissonance. The circle was used differently as a central symbol of perfect form. Composition 8 in 1923 is the main work of the Weimar period. Alongside with the conceptual works, at this time he created small worlds rich in fantasy and some chamber intimate pictures, such as Small Dream in Red. Also, Kandinsky lectured and exhibited in the USA. Having established together with Feiner, Javelinsky, and Klee Blue 4, in 1925, due to the right-wing party's attacks on the Bauhaus in Weimar was closed. The second period of Bauhaus in Dessau began in quite favorable conditions. Kandinsky and other artists conducted some free classes of painting, where they, besides teaching, could paint freely. Yellow, Red, Blue, in 1925, is one of the significant works of the describing stage of cold romanticism in Kandinsky's painting. A circle, which I recently used so often, could not be called otherwise but romantic. In the present-day, romanticism is essentially deeper, more beautiful, more substantial, and more salutary. It is a piece of ice in which fire is burning, and if people feel only cold and do not feel fire, so much the worse for them. In Dessau, Kandinsky with a new force was carried away with the romantic ideas of synthesis of arts in one work. These ideas were embodied in yellow sound and the graphic support of Mussorgsky's pictures to the exhibition. Kandinsky's painting of the last years in Bauhaus was penetrated with ease and strange humor, which again would be shown in his late Parisian works. For example, his picture Capricious in 1930 could be possibly referred to them. It evokes some cosmically Egyptian associations and is filled with fantastic symbolic images in the spirit of Paul Glut, the artist with whom Kandinsky made friends with at the time. About 1931, National Socialists started a large-scale campaign against Bauhaus, which led to its closing in 1932. Kandinsky immigrated to France, and between 1926 and 1933, Kandinsky painted 159 oils and 300 watercolors. Many of them, unfortunately, have been lost after Nazis declared Kandinsky's and many other artists' paintings to be degenerate. Mondrian was born in Amersfoort in the Netherlands, the second of his parents' children. The family moved into Winterswijk in the east of the country when his father, Peter Cornelius Mondrian, was appointed head teacher at the local primary school. Mondrian was introduced to art from a very early age. His father was a qualified drawing teacher, and his uncle, Fritz Mondrian, a pupil of Wilhelm Maris of Hague School of Artists. The younger Piet often painted and drew along the River Gien. After a strictly Protestant upbringing, in 1892, Mondrian entered the Academy for the Fine Arts in Amsterdam. He already was qualified as a teacher. He began his career as a teacher in primary education, but he also practiced painting. Most of his work from this period is naturalistic or impressionistic, consisting largely of landscapes. These pastoral images of his native country depict windmills, fields, and rivers, initially in the Dutch Impressionist manner of the Hague School, and then in a variety of styles and techniques documenting his search for a personal style. These paintings are most definitely representational, illustrating the influence of various artistic movements had on Mondrian, including pointillism and the vivid colors of Fauvism. On display in the Gemeente Museum in The Hague are a number of paintings from this period, including such post-impressionist works as The Red Mill and Trees and Moonrise. Another painting, Evening of Ond, painted in 1908, depicts a tree in a field at dusk, showing future developments by using a palette consisting of almost entirely red, yellow, and blue. Although it is in no sense abstract, Avant is the earliest of Mondrian's works to emphasize the primary colors. The earliest paintings to show an inkling of abstractionism to come are a series of canvases from 1905 to 1908, which depict dim scenes of indistinct trees and houses with reflections in still water. Although the result leads the viewer to begin to emphasize the forms over the content, these paintings are still firmly rooted in nature, and it is only the knowledge of Mondrian's later achievements that lead one to search for the roots of his future abstraction in these works. Mondrian's art was always intimately related to his spiritual and philosophical studies. In 1908, he became interested in the Theosophical movement launched by Helenova Petrovna Blavatsky in the late 19th century, and in 1909, he joined the Dutch branch of the Theosophical Society. The work of Blavatsky in a parallel spiritual movement, Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy, significantly affected the further development of his aesthetic. Blavatsky believed that it was possible to attain a more profound knowledge of nature than provided by empirical means, and much of Mondrian's work for the rest of his life was inspired by his search for that spiritual knowledge. Mondrian and his later work were deeply influenced by his 1911 Modern Kunststrong exhibition of Cubism in Amsterdam. His search for simplification is shown in two versions of Still Life with Ginger Pot in 1911 as Cubist, and 1912 reduced to a round shape with triangles and rectangles. In 1911, Mondrian moved to Paris and changed his name, dropping an A from the Mondrian to emphasize his departure from the Netherlands. This match changed the signature of his works that was dated before 1907. While in Paris, the influence of the Cubist style of Picasso and Georges Barak appeared almost immediately in Mondrian's work. Paintings such as The Sea, painted in 1912, and his various studies of trees from that last year contained a measure of representation, but increasingly they are dominant with geometric figures and interlocking planes. While Mondrian was eager to absorb the Cubist influence into his work, it seems clear that he saw Cubism as a pit stop on his artistic journey rather than a destination. Unlike the Cubists, Mondrian still attempted to reconcile his painting with his spiritual pursuits, and in 1913 he began to fuse his art from theosophical studies into a theory that signaled his final break from representational painting. While Mondrian was visiting home in 1914, World War I began, forcing him to remain in the Netherlands for the duration of the conflict. During this period, he stayed in the Lorraine artist colony, where meeting Bart van der Lek and Theo van Duisenberg, who were both undergoing their own personal journeys toward abstraction. Van der Lek's use of only primary colors in his art greatly influenced Mondrian. After a meeting with van der Lek in 1916, Mondrian wrote, "My technique, which was more or less cubist and therefore more or less pictorial, came under the influence of his precise method." With Van Doesburg, Mondrian founded Distill, a journal of the Distill Group, in which he published his first essay defining his theory, for which he adopted the term neoplasticism. Mondrian published The New Plastic in Painting in 12 installments during 1917 and 1918. This was his first major attempt to express his artistic theory in writing. Mondrian's best and most often quoted expression of his theory, however, comes from a letter he wrote to H.P. Bremer in 1914. "I construct lines and color combinations on a flat surface in order to express general beauty with the utmost awareness. Nature, or that what I see, inspires me and puts me, as with any painter, in an emotional state so that an urge comes about to make something. But I want to come out as close as possible to the truth and abstract everything from that, until I reach the foundation, still just an external foundation, of things. I believe that it is possible, through horizontal and vertical lines, to construct awareness, but not with calculation, led by high intuition and brought to harmony and rhythm, these basic forms of beauty, supplemented if necessary by other direct lines or curves, can become a work of art, as strong as it is true." When the war ended in 1918, Mondrian returned to France, where he would remain until 1938. Immersed in the crucible of artistic innovation that was post-war Paris, he flourished in an atmosphere of intellectual freedom that enabled him to embrace an art of pure abstraction for the rest of his life. Mondrian began producing grid-based paintings in the late 1919, and in 1920 the style for which he came to be renowned began to appear. In the early paintings of this style, the lines delineated the rectangular forms and are relatively thin, and they are gray, not black. The lines also tend to fade as they approach the edge of the painting, rather than stopping abruptly. These forms themselves, smaller and more numerous than in later paintings, are filled with primary colors, black or gray, and nearly all of them are colored, only a few are left white. During the late 1920 and 1921, Mondrian's paintings arrived at what is now casual observers as their definitive and mature form. Thick black lines now separate the forms, which are larger and fewer in number, and the more of them are left white, as previously the case. This was not a culmination of his artistic evolution, however. Although the refinements became more subtle, Mondrian's work continued to evolve during his years in Paris. In the 1921 paintings, many of the black lines, but not all of them, stopped short at seemingly arbitrary distance from the edge of the canvas. Although the divisions between the rectangular forms remain intact, here too the rectangular forms remain mostly colored. As the years passed and Mondrian's work evolved further, he began extending all of the lines to the edges of the canvas, but he also began to use fewer and fewer colored forms, favoring white instead. These tendencies are particularly obvious in the lozenge works that Mondrian began producing with regularity in the mid-1920s. The lozenge paintings are square canvases tilted 45 degrees, so that they hang in a diamond shape. Typical of these is Childry No. 1 lozenge with 2 lines in blue, painted in 1926, also known as composition with blue and composition of white and blue, which is currently on display at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. One of the most minimal of Mondrian's canvases, this painting consists of only 2 black perpendicular lines and a small triangular form colored blue. These lines extend all the way to the edge of the canvas, almost giving the impression that the painting is a fragment of a larger work. Although one is hampered by the glass protecting the painting, and by the toll that age and handling obviously taken on the canvas, the close examination of this painting begins to reveal that something of the artist's method. Mondrian's paintings are not composed of perfectly flat planes of color, as one might expect. Brushstrokes are evident throughout, although they are subtle, and the artist appears to have used different techniques for the various elements. The black lines are the flattest elements, with the least amount of depth. The colored forms have the most obvious brushstrokes, all running in one direction. Most interesting, however, are the white forms, which clearly have been painted in layers, using brushstrokes running in different directions. This generates a greater sense of depth in the white forms, as though they are overwhelming the lines and the colors, which indeed they were, as Mondrian's paintings of this period came to be increasingly dominant by white space. Childry No. 1 may be the most extreme extent of Mondrian's minimalism. As the years progressed, lines began to take precedence over forms in his paintings. In the late 1930s, he began to use thinner and thinner lines and double lines more frequently, punctuated with few small colored forms, if any at all. Double lines particularly excited Mondrian, for he believed they offered his paintings a new dynamism which he was eager to explore. In September 1938, Mondrian left Paris in the face of advancing fascism and moved to London. After the Netherlands were invaded and Paris fell in 1940, he left London for Manhattan, where he would remain until his death. Some of Mondrian's later works are difficult to place in terms of his artistic development because there were quite a few canvases that began in Paris or London, which he only completed months or years later in Manhattan. The finished works from his later period demonstrate an unprecedented business, however, more lines than any of his works since the 1920s. The lines were placed in an overlapping arrangement that is almost cartographical in appearance. He would spend many long hours painting on his own until his hands would blister and he sometimes cried or made himself sick. Mondrian produced lozenge composition with 4 yellow lines in 1933, a simple painting that introduced for what him was a shocking innovation, thick colored lines instead of black ones. After that one painting, this practice remained dormant in Mondrian's work until he arrived in Manhattan, at which time he began to embrace it with the abandon. In some examples of this new direction, such as composition painted in 1938, Place de la Concorde in 1943, he appears to have taken an unfinished black line paintings from Paris and completed them in New York by adding short perpendicular lines of different colors running between the longer black lines or from a black line edge of the canvas. The newly colored areas are thick, almost bridging the gap between lines and forms, and it is startling to see the color in Mondrian's painting that is unbounded by black. Other works mix long lines of red amidst familiar black lines, creating a new sense of depth by the addition of a colored layer on top of the black one. His painting Composition 10, painted in 1939 through 1942, is characterized by primary colors, white ground, and black grid lines clearly defined Mondrian's radical but classical approach to the rectangle. The new canvases that Mondrian began in Manhattan are even more startling, and indicate the beginning of a new idiom that was cut short by the artist's death. New York City, painted in 1942, is a complex lattice of red, blue, and yellow lines, occasionally interlacing a greater sense of depth than his previous works. An unfinished 1941 version of this uses strips of painted paper tape, which the artist could rearrange at the experiment with different designs. His painting, Broadway Boogie Woogie, painted in 1942 and 1943, at the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan, was highly influential in the school of abstract geometric painting. The piece was made up of a number of shimmering squares of bright color that leap from the canvas, then appear to shimmer, drawing the viewer into those neon lights. In this painting, an unfinished Victory Boogie Woogie, painted in 1942 through 1944, Mondrian replaced former solid lines with lines created with small adjoining rectangles of color, creating it in part by using small pieces of paper tape in various colors. Larger unbounded rectangles of color punctuated the design, some with smaller concentric rectangles inside them. While Mondrian's works of the 1920s and 1930s tend to have almost scientific austerity about them, these are bright, lively paintings reflecting an upbeat music that inspired them and the city in which they were made. In these final works, the forms have indeed usurped the roles of the lines, opening another new door for Mondrian's development as an abstractionist. The boogie-woogie paintings were clearly more revolutionary change than an evolutionary one, representing that the most profound development in Mondrian's work since his abandonment of representational art in 1913. In 2008, the Dutch television program Der Tijen found the only movie footage with Mondrian. The discovery of the film footage was announced at the end of a 2-year research program on the Victory Boogie Woogie. The research found that the painting was in very good condition and that Mondrian painted the composition in only one session. It was also found that the composition was changed radically by Mondrian shortly before his death by using small pieces of colored tape.
Georgia O'Keeffe had a very hard early life. Her parents had a rocky relationship, and her dad's bad choices led to him losing a lot of the family money built up by his parents and in-laws. However, her mom made her attend art classes when she was young because she thought she had talent. Georgia also moved around a lot. She moved 3 times during high school and attended 2 different colleges. Georgia always had artistic dreams, but the constant moving made it hard for her to develop a foundation. In 1908, Georgia was discouraged and stopped painting. She became a school teacher and was inspired to paint again in 1912 when she attended the University of Virginia and learned about Arthur Wesley Dow, who inspired her through his photographic paintings and pictures. O'Keeffe's abstraction came from a desire to create a new form of language that consisted of parts of speech from nature and imagination. She had a strong wish to communicate, connect, and inspire new thoughts and acts. O'Keeffe also used power photography in her paintings, which were somewhat unique and got her noticed in the world of art. In 1927, O'Keeffe was at the peak of her career. She was creating large flower and landscape paintings, which ended up being a crucial part of modern art. The abstract imagery O'Keeffe created in the teens and 20s served as a mode of self-expression. She could say things in color and shapes she couldn't say in any other way. Her illustrations were not scientific, but communicated insight and knowledge to those who looked. At her peak, O'Keeffe became the most famous and highly paid female artist in America. Also around the time of her peak, she married a man named Alfred Stieglitz. However, later on, he ended up cheating on her with a woman named Dorothy Norman. This broke her heart, and she had a nervous breakdown, also partly due to an uncompleted Radio City Music Hall mural that caused her to be hospitalized. However, after her split and breakdown, she returned to New Mexico and was featured in Vogue and Life magazine, which got her back on her artistic path and built her confidence. Georgia had an interest in the art and philosophy of China and Japan, like their nature and landscapes. One piece was Cow's Skull with Calico Roses, painted in 1931. This painting was the result of O'Keeffe seeing a drought in the Southwest that caused many animals to starve and die. Their skeletons were all over, and this fascinated O'Keeffe, so she had some skulls shipped to New York so she could paint them. The bones were beautiful to her, and she added the flowers to represent the graves of the animals. Another painting is one of her most famous pieces from 1919, Music Pink and Blue No. 2. There are many curvy lines with pastel colors and basic strokes. O'Keeffe was fascinated with the idea that music could be translated into something for the eye. This painting uses organic shapes and vivid colors to show forms in nature. Soft shapes flow across the painting, and the combination of colors creates visual rhythms and harmonies like music. Georgia's difficult past impacted her later life by causing her to act mean and hurt many of her friends. She became cold and isolated. However, in her later life, she had a relationship with a man named Dwan Hamilton, who was a sculptor and employee for Georgia in the past, but it never turned into anything. At age 84, O'Keeffe started rapidly losing her vision and started working with pottery, but continued to paint a few pieces. Georgia died in 1986 at the age of 98. She had a huge impact on the art community, leading the way for women in the art world and introducing and applying different styles of work. A museum dedicated to O'Keeffe opened in Santa Fe in 1997. It had 15,000 plus visitors just in the first weekend. O'Keeffe has also been the inspiration for many books and movies. Another important abstract painter was Kazimir Malevich. Malevich was born in February 1878 to a Polish family. He is named after the Polish king and was first of 14 children. He loved geometric figures and was inspired by the teachings of Pythagoras, like the idea that divine harmony in the universe was expressed in number. Malevich traveled to Moscow, where he was introduced to ideas like proportion, geometry, and new perspectives. Malevich is known for his use of geometry in his work. He was concerned with geometry from the beginning of his career, and he repeatedly used squares as his subject matter. Malevich's fascination with geometry and square formatting led him to create the most intriguing painting of the 20th century, Quadrilateral. It is just a black square, centrally placed within a white area extending to the edge of the canvas. Malevich defined abstractionism as means of thinking one's way out of the present and into the future. Malevich said he wanted to free art from the ballast of the objective world. This is similar to Kandinsky's view on art, which was to break from common perceptions of art. However, Malevich had a more complex career than just squares. After his dad died in 1904, he moved to Moscow and studied at the Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture. Malevich had great success here and started making a name for himself. Malevich's works were inspired by Natalia Gornikova and Mikhail Larionov, who were Russian painters. In 1907, Malevich started using tons of Cubist ideas in his work. In 1912, he even described his style as cubo-futuristic. And in 1915, Malevich set the foundation for what he is most famous for, and that is suprematism. Suprematism is a form of geometric abstract art that was developed in Russia in the years before the Bolshevik Revolution, and is considered one of the most radical developments in abstract art. Suprematism was introduced in Malevich's manifesto From Cubism to Suprematism. A couple of his famous suprematist pieces were Black Square and White on White. They are very basic, which goes along with what suprematism focuses on: circles, squares, rectangles, and lines. It is a very different geometric style of painting. The term suprematism refers to an abstract art based on the supremacy of pure artistic feeling, not on visual representation of objects. It also encouraged emphasis on the surface texture of the paint on the canvas. Suprematist painting broke away from the realism and was categorized by Malevich into 3 stages: black, colored, and white. Suprematism is definitely the biggest contribution Malevich gave to the art community. Malevich was also interested in aerial photography and aviation. This led him to abstractions somewhat inspired by aerial landscapes. Malevich died of cancer in St. Petersburg on May 15, 1935. Above his deathbed in Leningrad, he was shown with the black square above him. Malevich's most famous painting was Black Square in 1915. It is a very suprematist painting that is non-representational. There is just a black square that draws your attention and favors flatness over depth. There are no visual textures, and it is perfectly symmetrical. Black Square was a major turning point in Russian art and challenges everything about previous art. Black Square is a perfect square which goes along with his fascination with geometry. Another suprematist painting is White on White, painted in 1918. It is an oil painting on canvas. There is a white square with beige tones placed diagonally against a background of almost the same shade. There is no reference point for the viewer to focus on. This painting is designed to make it seem like the top square is floating above the canvas, a component of aerial photography. There are evident brushstrokes, and there are soft outlines shown. The painting plays with the illusion of depth and volume, and the outlines suggest a feeling of infinite space, not definite borders. These 4 artists were very influential in abstractionism. Abstractionism is regarded as the most characteristic form of 20th century art. It is a departure from accurate representation and challenged people's past perceptions of art. Abstraction enforced the idea of art having an emotional impact on people and started leaving the idea that paintings are just pictures on canvases. Suprematism emerged from abstract art. Suprematism was an art movement that focused on basic geometric figures founded by abstract painter Kazimir Malevich. Suprematism is similar to abstract art because it does not depict a certain scene, person, event, etc. Also, Cubism and Abstractionism existed around the same time, so some of the ideas bounced back and forth between the two movements, like the rich colors and non-representational ideas. Cubism is sometimes referred to as the first modern style of abstract art in the response to the rapidly changing art world sparked by Abstractionism. Dadaism also shares some ideas that Abstractionism presents, like invoking an experience and non-representational ideas. At first glance, it creates a what in the world reaction and rejects reason and logic. Another impact of Abstractionism is the controversy it created. Many people reject it, and still to this day don't accept it as art. Some people love it and believe it is an accurate representation of the artist's creativity. They also like how 100 different people could look at the same picture and interpret it in 100 different ways. On the other hand, some people are very critical of it. Many critics believe it takes no talent to produce it, like a kindergartner could do it. Abstract art has always been and will always be very controversial. The development and spread of abstract ideas led to more artists in the community because they were now able to express themselves in ways they really couldn't before. Artist freedom was basically unlimited, and new and exciting art was being produced like never before.